In 1975, a Kodak engineer invented the first digital camera. By the late 1990s, the company held over 1,000 patents in digital imaging. Yet, by 2012, that same company filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. This is the central paradox of Kodak's collapse. It was never a failure of invention. It was a failure of strategy. And the evidence? Well, it's right here, from Kodak's own final 10K filing. That red line tells the whole story. It tracks the complete annihilation of a $100 investment in Kodak stock between 2007 and 2012. You see the broader market recovering, even growing. But Kodak's value? It was almost completely erased. This wasn't a downturn. This was a wipeout. And by the end of 2012, the market had delivered its final brutal verdict. The value of a single share of Eastman Kodak had fallen to just 85 cents. Now, the common story you hear is that Kodak just missed the boat on digital. But that's not just wrong, it's a dangerously lazy explanation. The evidence shows they saw the boat coming. Heck, they helped design the boat and own the patents to its engine. So the real question isn't about awareness, it's about why. With all that knowledge, they stood on the dock and refused to get on board. Our autopsy reveals a condition fatal to so many established organizations, a deep-seated inability to adapt, born directly from the monumental success of its past. Today, we're going to dissect the evidence to reveal a universal lesson that every single leader needs to internalize. So, here's how we'll conduct this autopsy. We're going to proceed in 5 stages. First, we'll examine the external symptoms, the numbers. Then, we'll cut deeper into the company's internal liabilities, its flawed business model, and its resistant culture, before we arrive at our final diagnosis. Okay, let's begin by establishing the facts. The 2012 10K filing gives us the hard data, and frankly, the numbers themselves tell the story of the decline. You don't have to be a Wall Street analyst to see what's happening here. In just the 2 years leading up to the bankruptcy, net sales absolutely plummeted by over 31%. That's a loss of nearly $2 billion in revenue. This wasn't a slow leak. It was a company in a complete freefall. So you have to ask, what was actually left of the company by this point? Well, the segments that contained its traditional film and consumer imaging businesses, the things that made Kodak Kodak, accounted for less than 40% of revenue. The cash cows that built an empire were no longer capable of even sustaining it. So falling revenue is one thing. That's a symptom. Now we're going to cut deeper and look at the anatomy of the bankruptcy itself. The Chapter 11 filing reveals the underlying disease, the massive liabilities that were dragging the company underwater. When you look at the bankruptcy filing, it's like an X-ray of the company's fatal injuries. You see over $2.7 billion in liabilities, frozen, subject to court compromise. But look closer. The 2 heaviest anchors were debt and, crucially, these legacy pension and post-employment obligations. These are promises made in a much more profitable era, and the bill was coming due at the worst possible time. And to really understand the scale of this legacy burden, just consider this one fact. A single Kodak pension plan in the United Kingdom was underfunded by approximately $1.5 billion. That is not just some accounting issue. That's a massive financial anchor, consuming capital that was desperately needed for innovation and transformation. Okay, now we move from the what to the why. The financials show the symptoms of failure, but to find the root cause, we have to dissect the business model itself. This is where it gets really interesting. See, Kodak was built on the beautiful razor and blades model. You sell the cameras, the razors, cheaply, and then you make a fortune on the high-margin consumable film and paper, the blades. It was a money machine. The digital world was the exact opposite. Low-margin, one-time hardware sales in a hyper-competitive, open-for-all market. To embrace digital didn't just mean changing products. It meant abandoning the very economic model that made them a titan. So, facing this impossible choice, Kodak attempted a pivot. They started to monetize their vast patent portfolio, generating a massive $838 million in 2010 just by licensing their technology to the very competitors who were destroying their core business. For a moment, it looked like a lifeline. But it was a mirage. You cannot build a future on one-time payments for past innovations. And the 10K shows that this revenue stream completely collapsed by over 90% in a single year. It was a temporary fix, not a sustainable strategy. And this brings us to the internal pathology. You see, the flawed business model wasn't the only problem. It was protected and reinforced by a corporate culture that was perfectly optimized for a world that no longer existed. Peter Drucker's famous saying, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast," is the perfect epitaph for Kodak. No digital strategy, no matter how brilliant, could have survived inside a company where all the prestige, all the promotions, and all the power were tied to the chemical film business. And maybe the most damning piece of evidence in this entire autopsy comes from Kodak's own 2012 filing. Right there in the risk factors section, leadership openly admitted to their inability to manage the decline of traditional products. They documented their own failures. This autopsy shows that Kodak's collapse wasn't a failure of ignorance. It was a failure of execution. So all of this evidence, the financial collapse, the legacy liabilities, the business model trap, and the resistant culture, it all points to a single, powerful diagnosis, a diagnosis that applies to any successful organization today. We define this condition as strategic inertia. It's a pathology that is born from success. The very systems, the culture, and the financial models that create dominance in one era become the very chains that prevent adaptation in the next. At Kodak, we see a clear four-stage process. First, an over-reliance on the legacy profit engine of film. Second, a protective culture that rewarded defense, not disruption. Third, a deep-seated fear of cannibalizing those film profits. And finally, the immense financial drag of legacy costs that starved the future to pay for the past. The ultimate lesson from Kodak's autopsy is a warning that transcends time and industry. Your greatest strength today, the very product or model that defines your success, can become the anchor that sinks you tomorrow. So the critical question for every leader isn't, what is our competition doing, but rather, what part of our own success is blinding us to the future?